The June sun bore down on the Arizona plains like a giant blacksmith's forge. The ground was cracked wide open, long crevices stretching like old scars across the prairie. Elias Ward, a lean man past 40, dressed in a faded shirt, rode slowly along the northern fence line. He had always hated that fence, but still, he checked it. Dry seasons had a habit of stirring up trouble. His eyes stopped when he spotted a small shape at the base of a broken post. At first, he thought it was just a torn-up sack blown in by the wind. But as his horse drew closer, a tightness seized his chest. It was a little Apache girl, maybe 7 years old. Her body was curled up, her lips cracked and bleeding, and in her tiny hands, she clutched an empty canteen. Elias dropped to his knees and listened. Her breath was thin as spider silk. He looked around. No hoofprints, no sign of people. Just the hot wind scraping the skin off the world. And in that moment, he thought of his wife, who had died years ago from fever and sickness. Without another second of hesitation, Elias pulled his water skin from his belt and tilted the last precious drops onto the child's lips. She flinched, swallowed with a faint sound, and her small hand clutched at the bag. That was enough. Elias knew she still wanted to live. He lifted her up, light as a bundle of dry straw. Her frail little body burned against his chest like a bed of coals. Turning his horse, Elias headed back toward the cabin. Desert wind whipped his face and dust rose in choking swirls. But deep in his heart, one thing was now certain. From this moment on, no thirsty soul would ever find his door closed. Now, if it were you, what would you do with that little girl? Would you save her? Or would you ride on and leave her behind? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Elias Ward's cabin sat low and lonely in the middle of scorched land, where little creeks had once flowed but now were nothing more than dry streaks of white sand. All around was gray, withered grass and thorny shrubs poking out of the ground like ribs from a skeleton. The old windmill, which used to pump water for the cattle, had lost one of its blades. It creaked and groaned each time the hot wind swept through. In the water tank, nothing was left but thick, cracked mud. Elias laid the little girl down on the single bed near the wood stove. He lit a fire and warmed a small pot of water, just enough that he had managed to draw from the bottom of the clay jar. Wiping the dust from her face, he frowned. Her skin was sun-darkened, her shoulders sharp and frail, eyes barely open as if even that took too much strength. But her small chest kept rising and falling, stubbornly refusing to give in to death. Elias sat quietly in a chair, his eyes fixed on each breath she took. It had been 6 years since any sound but his own had filled this cabin. His wife, Clara, had died from fever during the damp season. Back then, Elias had still been a younger man, thinking that strength and bullets were all it took to keep a home safe. But sickness did not fear guns or grit. Clara was gone, leaving behind a cold wooden house and a heart sealed shut. Since that day, Elias had chosen solitude. He only went to town when he needed salt, bullets, or a few sacks of flour. Folks knew him as the quiet man, hard-edged, always tending to his skinny cattle and stubborn mules. He wanted no part of anyone's business. He wanted nothing to do with land disputes, well-water arguments, or the growing rumors about Kane Morrison, the man building a dam out east and selling water by the barrel at ruthless prices. But now, in this cabin once filled with wind and crackling fire, there was something else. The faint breath of a child. Elias felt the silence begin to crack. He let out a slow sigh and brushed the sweat-damp hair from her forehead, whispering more to himself than to her. "All right, little one, you hang in there. You keep on living." That night, Elias did not sleep. He sat by the stove, listening to the wood pop and hiss, watching the firelight dance across the walls. Outside, the desert wind howled like a pack of thirsty beasts, but inside the cabin, the fire kept the child warm. Elias understood something deep and final. The moment he gave her his last drop of water, his life was no longer just his own. At dawn on the third day, the first light spilled over the low mountains to the east, turning the scorched prairie into a sea of blinding gold. Elias stepped out onto the porch, his eyes bloodshot from 3 sleepless nights. Inside the cabin, the little girl still slept. Her breathing had grown steadier, and the gray pallor was fading from her skin. Elias picked up the empty canteen she had clung to and quietly hung it on the wall, as if to remind himself it was that very canteen that marked a turning point. One of the mules suddenly snorted and pawed at the dirt. Elias frowned, eyes scanning the distant horizon. At the far edge of the cracked land, 3 figures appeared, standing tall beneath the harsh sunlight. They were on foot, moving slow but steady. And as they came closer, Elias noticed something strange. They were all larger than most folks he had ever seen. The one in front was an Apache woman, broad-shouldered like a pillar, with long black hair braided heavy down her back. A deerskin dress clung to her solid frame. She stopped about 20 paces from the porch. Her eyes were bright, sharp, sorrowful, and proud all at once. Behind her stood 2 others, a younger woman with thick muscles beneath a patched dress, and an older one whose face was leathered by sun and wind. They stood silent, their breath rising in the hot morning air. No one moved. No one shouted. The silence was heavy as stone. Elias placed a hand on the grip of his rifle, not to draw it, just out of habit. The woman in front took a single step forward. Her voice was low and firm, cutting through the wind without needing to rise. "You are holding our sister." Elias did not move. His heart beat steady like a war drum. Words felt useless. He turned slightly, glancing back into the cabin, where the little girl lay curled beneath a rough wool blanket. When he faced them again, the 3 sets of eyes were still locked on him, watchful, trembling, and sharp as a blade testing for weakness. For a split second, Elias thought about placing the girl outside the door and letting fate decide, but something inside his chest had already made up its mind. He swallowed hard. His voice cracked from the desert air. "She is still breathing, thanks to my water. If she's kin, then come take her." The towering woman gave a slight nod. The morning light carved a bold line across her face, and in that moment, Elias saw it beneath the weathered skin. Those eyes held no hate, only pain, and something close to gratitude. The 3 figures stepped onto the wooden porch, their heels thudding firm against the boards. The quiet cabin, long used to its stillness, now seemed to tremble under their presence. The little cabin was no longer silent as it once had been. When the 3 towering women stepped inside, the low wooden ceiling seemed ready to cave in, and the firelight flickered across their sun-scarred faces. The Apache girl, just waking, sprang from the bed and ran straight into the arms of her eldest sister. Their embrace was so tight that Elias could hear the breath hitching in their chests. No one cried aloud, but in that moment, their reunion spoke louder than any words ever could. Elias quietly poured water into a chipped metal bowl and placed it on the table. The eldest woman, massive in frame but moving with an unexpected gentleness, knelt down, broke a piece of dry bread in half, and gave it to the girl. Then she looked at Elias with steady eyes. There were no words of thanks, and none were needed. In that single nod, Elias understood they knew the truth. He had saved her life. In the days that followed, the cabin took on the shape of a small camp. They shared every precious drop of water, even stitching fabric into makeshift sacks to catch dew in the cold dawn. The younger one, her name was Yara, was strong as any ranch hand, hoisting logs nearly half Elias's size to build a shade fence. The older woman, Toma, patiently dug a shallow trench behind the house, hoping to strike a pocket of groundwater. Elias, who had always worked alone, now found himself part of something larger. He showed them how to patch the old water lines, and they taught him how to read the soil for signs of hidden moisture. At night, they sat around the fire, listening to the wind howl like the earth itself was grieving. The little girl, now more alert, whispered words in Apache, and sometimes giggled when Yara made silly shapes with burning sticks. Elias watched them. He saw in them not just the strength of giants, but the resilience of souls who would not bow to drought, to raiders, or to sorrow. These women had survived losses he could not even imagine, and yet they stood tall here, proud and unbroken in the sunburned dust. One night, as Elias was pouring water from the clay jar into a pot, Nara, the eldest, stepped beside him and took hold of the bucket with him. Her hands were large and calloused, but when they touched his, he felt a quiet tenderness. They said nothing. They simply hauled the bucket together, sweat and dust glimmering on their faces in the firelight, and deep in Elias's chest, something stirred. This cabin, once a shelter for a solitary man, was slowly becoming a home despite the cracked earth and the near-empty water tank. I am truly grateful for your presence here. If this story reminded you that kindness still lives, that love can bloom even in the harshest deserts, and in the dustiest evenings, please subscribe to my channel, so that each day, we might sit together once again. That night, the desert wind rose, kicking up pale dust like a ghostly fog, but bringing no hint of moisture. The cabin shuddered with every gust as the wind howled past the wooden walls. Elias sat on the porch, a flickering oil lamp in his hand. The dim yellow light danced across his weathered face as he stared out into the black prairie, where the drought felt like a faceless beast devouring everything in its path. The wooden door creaked open. Nara stepped out, her tall figure filling half the doorway. Her old, tattered deerskin dress flapped in the wind, revealing sun-darkened, muscular arms. But her eyes, in that moment, did not belong to a warrior. They were the eyes of a sister, a mother exhausted. She sat down beside him, and the porch boards groaned under her weight. For a long time, there was only the wind. Then Nara spoke, her voice rough, like it had been carved out of stone. "We once had a village. A stream ran down from the mountains. Then they built a dam. The water stopped. The night they came, they set fire to the camp. Those who ran fast lived. Those who didn't stayed behind." Elias did not look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the darkness, but his chest tightened. He thought of Clara, his wife, who had left this world because of a fever, while he sat by helplessly, unable to save her. His calloused hands clenched, then slowly released. "I lost someone too," Elias murmured. "Not to fire, but to sickness. Sitting there, hearing each breath fade away. It hurts worse than any bullet." They sat in silence. Two different sorrows dried out to the bone. Then Nara passed the bucket to him, and they poured the water into the jar together. Her large hand brushed his. She did not pull away. She did not flinch. Elias looked up. In the lamplight, her face showed every scar, every line etched by time. But there was something else, pride, and a quiet tenderness that needed no words. They held each other's gaze for a single breath. Just long enough. Long enough for Elias to understand. They were no longer strangers lost in the desert. A sudden dust devil swept across the yard, lifting sand and brittle leaves. Nara reached out and steadied the oil lamp, her hand firm as stone. Elias chuckled softly, the first laugh he had let out in years, and said, "If the sky still wants to test us, let it test both of us." Nara pressed her lips together. A strange light flickered in her eyes. She nodded, slowly, like a promise made without the need for oaths. And in that moment, Elias knew. The drought might drain the strength from their bones, but it could not kill a hope just beginning to take root. By midday, the sun hammered down like it was trying to burn a hole through the sky. Elias had just finished stacking the last of the dry firewood when the mule jerked its reins and backed into a corner of the yard, snorting in fear. In the distance, a red cloud of dust was rising, headed straight for the cabin. Elias lifted a hand to shield his eyes. His heartbeat thudded heavy in his chest. Someone was coming. Out of the swirling dust, more than a dozen riders appeared. Leading the pack was a heavy-set man in a long black coat, a bright red silk scarf tied around his neck. He sat high in the saddle, a half-burned cigar clenched in his teeth. It was Kane Morrison, the man long rumored to have dammed the eastern stream and sold water to desperate folks at a cutthroat price. As the horses stopped, Kane blew out a puff of smoke. His voice was high-pitched, yet cold as stone. "Ward, I hear you've been holding on to a few things that do not belong to you." Elias stood tall, one hand resting on the fence post. He made no move for his gun. "I've got a roof here. Anyone who walks in, I give them rest. That's all." Kane let out a raspy laugh that sounded like rust scraping steel. He pulled a crumpled paper from his coat and held it up. "This here's a court-stamped water rights permit. The stream, the wells, all the land around it. It's mine. And I hear those Apaches ran the night we cleared their camp. What's mine comes back to me." From inside the cabin, Nara stepped out. Her towering frame cast a long shadow over the cracked ground. Her dark eyes burned with fury. Yara and Toma followed, forming a wall of silent strength across the porch. Kane leaned back in the saddle, smirking. "See? They know they belong to me." Elias spat into the dust, his voice dry and hoarse. "No one belongs to you. This water's meant to keep people alive, not to be sold. And people are not property." Behind Kane, his men shifted in their saddles, hands inching toward their holsters. The air grew thick, ready to ignite under the blaze of the sun. Elias lifted the Winchester from the fence post, not aiming it, just resting it steady in his arms, the stock firm against his hip. You can bring your papers, your gold, even your guns, but you are not stepping through this door. A blast of hot wind swept through, lifting dust and sand into the sky like a curtain. Kane squinted. His cigar fell to the dirt, still burning. He knew Elias Ward was not bluffing. No blood had spilled, not yet, but the line had been drawn. Water and life would be protected within these walls. Kane tugged the reins, his face darkening. All right, Ward, you just made yourself an enemy. As he turned his horse and rode off, Elias could feel the eyes of the three women behind him. For the first time, they held not just pain but something more. Trust. 3 days later, the sun hung overhead like a blade of fire. Elias had just finished tying the mule when he heard hoofbeats pounding from the east. A red cloud of dust swallowed the horizon. Kane Morrison had returned, and this time, not with a dozen men, but nearly 40 gunslingers. Cloaks flapped in the wind, and rifles gleamed under the scorching sun. Kane rode at the front, face red as a furnace, waving that same crumpled piece of paper. "Ward," he shouted, "today I'm taking back what's mine. The water and the people." Inside the cabin, Nara placed a large hand on Elias's shoulder. Her voice was low and steady, like the beat of a war drum. "We are done running. If we must stand, we stand here." Elias nodded and stepped out onto the porch, Winchester in hand. He did not aim it, just held it across his waist, his eyes calm. Kane laughed harshly and threw up a hand. His men fanned out in a wide arc, circling the cabin like wolves around a cornered prey. Then, from the west, came a deep, echoing horn. The ground trembled. Another wave of dust rose thicker, heavier, rolling forward like a storm. Hundreds of Apache riders burst into view, black and brown horses charging, feathers and braids flying in the wind. The thunder of hooves shook the earth. Kane spun around, his face turning pale. His men hesitated, some began tugging their reins, backing away. An Apache leader rode to the front and raised a battered canteen, the same one Elias had found with the little girl. Burn marks and dried blood still scarred its side. His voice rang out like a hammer striking steel. "We found this at the dry stream. This man," he pointed directly at Kane, "blocked the river, stole our water, and murdered our people." The Apache warriors shouted in unison, raising their spears. Their eyes blazed with fury. Under that weight, many of Kane's men dropped their weapons. Horses reared and whinnied. Kane screamed curses, but his voice was drowned beneath the thunder of hooves and war cries. Elias stepped down from the porch, voice steady and low. "The day you built that dam, you turned the desert into a graveyard. But here I will not let that happen." Kane drew his pistol, but before he could aim, an arrow slammed into the dirt right in front of his horse's hooves. The animal reared in panic, throwing Kane hard into the red dust. His gang scattered, some tossed down their guns and fled on foot. Others galloped off toward the mountains. Kane struggled to rise, but 2 Apache riders seized him by the arms and dragged him before their leader. His forged water permit fell from his coat, fluttering uselessly into the hot sand. No bullet had been fired, but the truth had struck harder than lead. And in the blazing sunlight, Elias saw it clearly. This weathered wooden cabin was no longer just a shelter for one man. It had become the stronghold of a family, a community, and a cause worth defending. As the red dust settled, the land in front of the cabin fell into stillness. Kane was bound tightly, dragged away like a worthless sack of grain. His hired guns had vanished past the horizon, leaving behind only dry wind and the blazing sun. Elias lowered his Winchester and exhaled a long, quiet breath he had not realized he was holding. Nara and her sisters approached. The little Apache girl, her eyes now bright again, stepped hesitantly toward Elias. She looked up at the tall, sun-weathered man, his gray eyes still and silent as stone. Then, suddenly, she spoke. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "Father." That word pierced straight through Elias's chest, not to wound, but to open something that had been locked away for far too long. He dropped to one knee, his calloused hand resting gently on her small shoulder. His eyes, for the first time in years, shimmered with moisture. "Yes, I'm here." The Apache riders stood in quiet witness. Several nodded solemnly. The elder leader stepped forward and spoke. Today, Ward did not close his door to the thirsty. so this water will flow again for all. Together, they tore down Cain's crude wooden dam. Water rushed back through the dry stones, roaring like the voice of the earth itself. The first stream flowed into the wooden trough, right in front of the cabin. Elias rolled up his sleeves. With Nara and her sisters beside him, they guided the flow into a waiting jar. They stood there, eyes wide, watching the cool, clear water shimmer. A miracle returned. That evening, for the first time in years, laughter echoed around the cabin. Yara and Toma hauled buckets, whistling as they went. The little girl sat on the porch, hugging the old canteen now filled to the brim. Drops spilled down her shirt, but she giggled anyway. Elias sat on the porch steps, his gaze lost in the horizon. Beside him, Nara placed a strong, steady hand on his shoulder. She said nothing. She did not need to. In her eyes, Elias saw something he thought he had lost long ago: trust. The old cabin, once just dry timber and dust, had become a home for people who no longer wanted to run. As the fiery sunset stretched across the prairie, Elias whispered soft enough to sound like he was talking to himself, but loud enough for all to hear. Out here in the West, gold never saved a soul, but a sip of water at the right time just might build a family. My friends, the West once taught us something worth remembering. Riches fade, bullets rust, but a drink shared with the thirsty that lives on. Sometimes, the most precious thing is not in the well, but in the heart that's willing to open its door. If you feel the same, let me know where you're listening from, so we can remember the cowboy days together. And do not forget to subscribe for more gripping tales from the Wild West.